These are the top 5 philosophy books that have elevated my consciousness in 2022. If you are getting into philosophy, I would recommend number 1. If you are getting into philosophy, I would recommend number 3. Number 1, Essays and Aphorisms by Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is the biggest pessimist in German history, and he was actually a big influence on Friedrich Nietzsche. His pessimism knows no bounds, and he is actually well known in some darker parts of the internet for his misogyny. Take, for example, this passage. The nobler and more perfect a thing is, the later and more slowly does it mature. The man attains the maturity of his reasoning powers and spiritual faculties hardly before his 28th year. The woman with her 18th. And even then, it is only reasoning power of a sort, a very limited sort. Thus, women remain children all their lives, never see anything but what is closest to them, cleave to the present moment, take appearances for reality, and prefer trifling to the most important affairs. Well, next to his misogyny, Schopenhauer also brings Eastern philosophy to the West. And for our Western taste, Eastern philosophy might be a bit too spicy, so he kind of dilutes it and makes it more digestible for Western tastes. For example, the more clearly you become conscious of the frailty, vanity, and dreamlike quality of all things, the more clearly will you also become conscious of the eternity of your own inner being. All this means, to be sure, that life can be regarded as a dream and death as the awakening from it. But it must be remembered that the personality, the individual, belongs to the dreaming and not to the awakened consciousness, which is why death appears to the individual as annihilation. In any event, death is not, from this point of view, to be considered a transition to a state completely new and foreign to us, but rather a return to originally our own, from which life has been only a brief absence. Well, Eastern philosophy believes that emptiness is basically where we come from. Some of these passages read a bit like a hermetic text, and they can be a bit cryptic and obscure, but it's definitely worth it. And I found myself constantly writing on this book, writing notes, and I was having a conversation with Schopenhauer, because on some points I was not really agreeing with him. Like, for example, you can see here my notes. And the funny thing is, he really brings the Eastern philosophy. In Schopenhauer's thought, even reincarnation pops his head around the corner. So if you're getting into Western philosophy, this might not be the best place to start. But if you have a somewhat of a grasp of how the ancients from the Greeks used to think about things, then this might be a good place. Well, I find myself scribbling away in this book like I was conversing with Schopenhauer. It was really fun. And some points I did feel connected to his thought, because most of these texts he wrote when he was around 20, 23. So it really resonated with me and my arrogant youthful mind. It's almost like having a conversation with a friend who lived 200 years ago. A lot of these thoughts, they might be wrong, I might be wrong as well. I'm just like 23, so what do I know? But it is a very interesting read with some aha moments in between. If you want to start philosophy, it is not a bad starting point, and you also have this beautiful edition by Penguin Classics. I'd recommend having a pencil with you so you can write your thoughts after each passage, if you would so desire. Number 2. I went from being a mentorless schmuck to being guided by the richest man in all of Rome. This is Letters from a Stoic from Seneca. Seneca writes these letters at the end of his life. He was serving Nero for 10 years. After his advising work was done for Nero, he decided to write letters to Lucius, who was also going to be a statesman in Sicily. You really feel like Seneca's pupil, and every letter he gives you a little bit of wisdom, a quote, and his own hardships on and how he actually overcame them. Seneca has lived through almost all of the troubles, especially because he was advising Nero, and he just overcomes them gracefully. This book shows you the shimmers of death that Seneca was facing. Seneca actually decided to take his own life in the most honorable way, and it really shows you the wisdom of how to live life and how to live stoically. If you're not reading this one, you're definitely doing yourself a disservice. Letters from a Stoic. He ends every letter with a quote. Here's a quote of the Stoic writer Hecatto. Cease to hope, and you will cease to fear. But how, you will ask? Can things as diverse as these be linked? Here's a quote from Hecatto, a Stoic writer. Limiting one's desire actually helps to cure one of fear. Definitely read this one. Number 3. Meditations. Imagine you are the most powerful man in the world. What would you do? Why not have orgies and drink wine every day? Well, Marcus Aurelius saw his Senate live like this, while he was aiming to be the most wise person. As an emperor, he strove to be the wisest person he could be, and the best person for his empire. He is what Plato would see as the philosopher king, or at least the closest version of it. The struggles between Marcus and his connection towards people who were far less wise than him and far less restrained than him are written in his memoirs. He speaks to himself on how to live life and how to not be bothered by everyone around him doing the wrong things. Marcus was even so chill that when he was betrayed, he forgave the betrayers. Marcus Aurelius was loved across the whole empire, and he is known as the last good emperor. And with this book, you get to think with his mind. I highly recommend it, and there are some quotes which I use daily to smash the day. For example, when you are reluctant to get up from your sleep, remind yourself that it is your constitution and a man's nature to perform social acts, whereas sleep is something you share with dumb animals. Now, what accords with the nature of each being is thereby the more closely related to it, the more in its essence, and indeed the more to its liking. Remind yourself that it is human to get up and do work for others, whereas sleep is something a stupid animal would do. Hey, what are you, some kind of sleeping schmuck? I still apply parts of this book daily, and sometimes when I feel my temper or my impatience getting stronger and stronger, I read this book to cool myself down. So I will definitely reread it again this year. Number 4, Lao Tzu. Tao Te Ching. I'll be honest, when I read this book at first, I didn't completely get it, but when I put it into the context of Qing Dynasty China, where basically everyone was warring with each other, it makes sense. But for me, the first time when I read it, most of the philosophy and morals come from some sort of weakness. So I'll be honest, I did not totally get this book, and I don't get why this is some sort of seminal work in philosophy. Maybe I'm stupid or blind, but they're talking about the way, and I kind of get what they're talking about with the Taoism, like the middle road or whatever, but it's a bit too cryptic, a bit too obscure for me, so I think I'll have to dive into it a bit more and perhaps not read it as quickly as I did before, but really try to digest every word and every page. So I will reread this year and see if my opinion has changed. Honorable mention, Bed of Procrustes by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Short, snappy, and venomous, it gives its contents like a tweet. Every aphorism in this book stops you in your tracks. You either laugh, you get angry, or you start to think. Nassim really shows his knack for distilling his wisdom in bite-sized tweet-like forms. But reading this book is like medicine. You don't want to completely overdo it. You just take one a day, and that will keep the Wall Street trader away. Not more, or else you will overdose, and that is a promise. Number 5, Genealogy of Morals. I really love this book, and that's one of the reasons why I don't have it here. I actually lended it out to a friend of mine, but he aims at answering one of the deepest questions that we have, and that would be what is right or wrong, but he goes even further than that. He looks at where does right and wrong actually come from? What decides what is right or what is wrong? Not what is it, but who decides it? Because in his view, there are two types of people in history. You would have the slaves and you would have the masters. And in his eyes, the slaves, which were the Jews, the slaves in Egypt, they used their weakness as their strength. And then they saw everything which the masters would see as good as evil. So anything that was powerful or magnificent or, what you would say Roman was evil in their eyes. And everything that was meek and submissive and, pious or ascetic, doing nothing, just eating less or whatever, that was seen as good. For example, he sees Christianity's forgiveness as the inability to take revenge, while the Romans were always able to take revenge, and when they did it fiercely. According to him, Christians had no other choice than to forgive, while the Romans, had the choice to take revenge, which they did. And in their eyes, that was good because they could do so. According to Nietzsche, the weak have now won and taken over our moral structures, and this causes some weakness to be presented and a lack of geniuses being born. A lack of magnanimous living happening right now in the West could be attributed his idea of the weak having won and the master morals being suppressed. I do warn you, if you read this, you will pull a lot of parallels between how we live right now and the thinking of Nietzsche. I could not help but see slave morals, as he describes, dominating our culture right now. Are free spirits the one making their own morals? Yes, but they are definitely paying for it. An eye-opening read, and I'm curious to see if my opinion on it has changed this year, so I will definitely reread it. These are the top 5 philosophy books I will reread this year. Click the link in the description to support the channel and buy yourself one of these books. I will see you in the next video.